So thank you all. We have a robust presentation we want to get through. So at this time, I'm going to call the meeting to order. If you're wondering why I'm holding this microphone, it's not because of you here. It's so that the people at home, the millions of viewers that are watching this, can hear me. So I apologize if I look silly. But at this time, I do want to call the meeting to order. The time now being 7:01 or 7:02. I am Vice Chair Chris Gallo for the Wrentham Select Board. I'm calling this meeting to order. It's Thursday, May 9th, 2024. In accordance with Chapter 2 of the Acts of 2023, this Thursday, May 9th, 2024, 7 o'clock public meeting of the Select Board shall be conducted at the Fisk Public Library in the Sweat Room here at 110 Randall Road in Wrentham. At this time, since the meeting is now called to order, I'd like to ask Selectman Harrington to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Thank you. I pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Selectman Harrington. As we're going to get going here, we appreciate everyone coming in attendance. We appreciate all the dialogue back and forth about the MBTA community zoning legislation. And as I just wanted to briefly update people who might not have been following this, what the Select Board and the town have been trying to accomplish here in getting information out to the public. We've taken a three-prong approach, the first prong being communication and relief with the state. We've asked the state for relief to see if they could, grant us any kind of waivers. That really hasn't led us in anything fruitful at this point. So simultaneously, our prong number two is that we're reanalyzing parcels. We're having we had a joint meeting with our planning board, and originally there were 2 parcels presented to the townspeople. We asked them to go back and add more parcels to that. We want a more robust parcel examination to see what parcels could actually be zoned to provide the least amount of negative impact to our infrastructure and our town services should we zone this in. The third prong is why we're here this evening. We've been asked by the 12,000 residents to talk to a group of attorneys who are leading the charge with a legal challenge. So we want to know if this MBTA Communities Act is constitutional, legal, and enforceable. And that's why we're here tonight. So by no means does this presentation represent the Select Board's views or the town's views. Our job as the elected body is to provide information so that you and us, who happen to also be voters in this community, can make the most educated decision possible when this goes to town meeting. Is that fair? Okay. With that being said, I'm going to ask that before I turn the meeting over to Selectwoman Rouse, I'm going to ask and say that to keep this presentation moving as it is robust, we're going to hold all public comment and question until the end, time permitting, so that we can get through this presentation. If we ask questions every 3 minutes, we'll never get through it. And I think there's a lot of information here that is going to be very beneficial for us as a group to hear. With that being said, I'm going to ask Selectwoman Rouse to come up and introduce our guests.
Thank you.
Thank you, Selectwoman Rouse.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. We appreciate you coming to this presentation this evening. I wanted to add a little bit more to what Vice Chair Gallo has said to how we got here, to kind of backtrack in the information that we've shared to everyone in town so that you're aware. Starting back in February 6th, our town planner as well as the planning board made their presentation to the town regarding the MBTA mandate and the parcels that they were recommending. From there, on February 27th, the select board, along with the planning board, had a meeting in which we kind of mapped out our plan, what Vice Chair Gallo had said, our three-prong approach, and we shared the letters that we had sent to Governor Healy, Senator Walsh, and our state representative, Marcus Vaughn, in which we stated what the mandate would be doing if the 750 units were zoned here in Wrentham to our town, our infrastructure, our services, and how it would change what Wrentham is. From there, on March 19th, Chris Clutchman, who is the director of the state's Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities, joined our select board meeting and provided information there. On May 1st, a few weeks ago, our select board had a joint meeting with the planning board and the board of assessors to discuss further parcels that we could look at and to further talk about the mandate for the town. And in addition, every select board meeting since the beginning of February has had a running agenda item to talk about the MBTA community, so that if there was any further information that could be shared, we had the opportunity to do that between meetings. All of this information is on our town websites, all the recorded meetings, as well as any letters that have been sent to state and local government. So I encourage you to continue your information gathering, look at those meetings, read those letters. I'm glad that you're here tonight with an open mind for more information sharing. So that continued sharing comes with our group here now. I am welcoming Michael Walsh from Linfield, our attorney, and his team. I'm going to turn it over to our friends from the North Shore and welcome them to Wrentham.
Welcome. Thank you. Hi, everybody. My name is John Kulikowski. I'm from Rockport, resident of Rockport. I'm a chemical engineer by trade, and we've given this presentation to a number of towns. We've done this at Rockport, Gloucester, Manchester, Boxford, Winthrop, Raleigh, Wakefield, Shrewsbury, Hamilton, Wrentham, and I guess we're going to be doing Millbury, Marshfield. Going to do Hamilton again. They want us to talk a little further with them, and Swampscott, possibly. Why do we do these presentations? We think there's a problem. We're concerned about it. We're not paid. We're all volunteers. No one's getting money, and we don't look for donations. So we're doing this only because we think it's needed to be done. Okay? And I think Wrentham perhaps has the same mindset. There's some people here who are concerned what may happen to their town, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent, or they want to control what happens to their town one way or the other. And as anybody in the town, if they like their town, they would like to make sure it goes in the right direction for their future and the future life of the citizens there. More and more towns are saying no to the state mandate. Milton started it, but Marblehead, Raleigh, Wakefield, Wilmington, Littleton, Knoll, Marshfield, and Holden are all pushing back. There's probably more towns, but I don't have the most current list yet, and we're trying to get that out there. We had a town meeting back in 2022 in Rockport, and we didn't like a few things that happened at the town meeting. And as a result, we filed a lawsuit at that time. So this was back in 2022. The process in the court system is very slow. We may have a court appearance on May 14th. That's our target, which may actually be postponed. We're not sure. There's enough towns that joined us that we actually put in for a class action lawsuit that will be heard at that time too. And right now there's, I guess, 14 towns that joined us, okay? These are groups of people in the town, not the town themselves, okay? But there was enough activity. Michael, you remember the count we had?
I believe it was 10 towns coming out of 15.
No, the number of people though.
Oh, upwards of 250.
Okay, all right. Not a lot in the whole scope of things, but it takes a lot for people to act. And it's, I thought it was very significant. The subject of this meeting is really the mandate, or 3A, and it can be simplified, okay, really, when you come down to it. The state is asking us to give up our legal rights of controlling our town, okay? Our town zoning to really a bureaucratic entity that's going to be the state. And they can ultimately and arbitrarily change zoning. People don't realize that, but once the zonings are established, they can change that. If you look at some of the notes that Salem applied with them, and you look at some of the notes back and forth between the state and Salem puts up a certain number of units, and the state comes back, we want this, and they have to comply. If you don't comply, you're out of compliance. So you will lose control. There's a lot of people that are saying that the town will control it, and the administration control it. It doesn't look that way, okay? And let's go into a little bit more of that. And what are you getting in return to give up your rights to control your own zoning? There's apparently 4 grant groups, okay? Did you guys, I assume you investigated the grants in your town? Did you look at it for like the last 5 to 10 years
Yes.
perhaps?
Yes.
And I'm just curious, what did you find?
Turn it over to our town manager.
Town manager suite?
Yeah, we've received a couple of those. We received one MassWorks grant in the last 10 and a housing choice grant.
And how much,
related
if
to-
you don't mind me asking?
I think it was the MassWorks, I think was 2.1, just before my
Yeah.
time, so it was
Yeah.
like in 2016, I believe.
So
And nothing since then.
Okay,
It was
And,
8 years ago?
Yeah. it was-
okay, so if you average it out, it's not that a lot, especially with the budget, if you, what's your budget like?
We've applied for others like that, but it's the only MassWorks we've received.
Yeah. Okay, so really what they're offering you is the opportunity to keep applying. If you comply with the mandate, all they're saying is, we give you the right to keep applying, and that's what it boils down to. And they're really paying you with your own money. I mean, this is your tax money when it comes down to it. So they want you to apply, to submit and commit your rights to the state entity in exchange for just the opportunity that you currently have. That's what it boils down to. In Rockport, we became aware that some of the town officials and planning board members were simply doing what the state wanted done, and they were ignoring pretty much what the citizens were asking and inquiring about. And they didn't seem to be really concerned with the ramifications of what this mandate would do, and how the town may change, and actually what the expenses may be if you comply with the mandate. After all, what is it, you said 740 units? Was it?
750.
750, okay. If you really look at what the 750 units look like, first of all, they're not age restricted in the mandate. They are also family friendly supposedly in the mandate. So even if that's 740 more kids or 80% of that kids, how does that impact your school? Okay, I think the school was something like, is it 29,000, I think, per pupil in years now? I looked up the numbers just the other day.
The education cost per pupil?
Yes.
It's somewhere around 30,000.
It's lower 20s.
Lower 20?
Well, according to the printout for 22, I think it's 29 and change. So anyway,
Yeah, we have a regional school district.
21, Manchester 6 is 19.
K through 6, so they're different costs.
okay,
Because the regional school district covers all in,
right.
whereas the elementary school, the town, is an accommodated cost, shares of costs that aren't factored in. But so they're actually done out differently.
Okay.
Cost per student.
All right, but whether it's 29,000, whatever it is, you figure is, do you just, multiply that by the number of students? There's other factors, of course. And does the train come to you out here?
No, we're adjacent.
So, all right, so you don't even have the train service? Even though you're paying for it, you know that through the years, you've been paying for the MBTA. But anyway. Well, these are some of the questions that you really should think about. And it sounds like you guys did some research, so I assume you are aware of it, but we'll go into it in a minute. But what are the ramifications for your town? What's going to happen? These zones that you're picking out, how will it affect the other areas and so forth? There's a lot of expenses to be considered, okay? But anyway, getting back to what I think we should be made aware of and why I think we should know more of a full picture of what's going on is that, like I said, some of the town officials have been directing how should I put it, I guess the marketing of the MBTA mandate to people without giving the whole picture, okay? And I'm just trying to give a better picture. How many people in the audience are aware of home rule? Anybody aware of home rule? All right, you guys are, anybody else?
Assume, you can give a quick definition if you want, but again, we want to keep the participation to the end, so that we
I
can get through the
understand that, but it's,
So home rule petition?
yeah,
Right.
okay. There's something I just want to point out.
Please, yes.
All right. But it's not commonly known, and we'll go into that in a little while, okay? As you know, if a town refuses to accept a mandate, the state has threatened to deny them access to certain grants. But you know now how much those grants amounted to through the years. So you have to compare it to your normal budget. How many of you would believe most of the towns and cities have already agreed to the following the mandate? A lot of people are reading headlines that the mandate has been passed by almost all the towns and all that. And to some extent that's true, but only the paperwork aspect of it. The towns still have the right to vote, and sometimes they're voting for it, and sometimes they're voting against it. Until they make that vote, the mandate has not been accepted. So this is really not actually true that all these towns are following in and following the mandate. So it's sort of misleading the way they're presenting that. It sounds like your town possibly looked into the legality of the mandate, okay? So that's good if you did. I assume you touched base with your legal counsel to see if that is legal or not legal. And did your town, you got to ask if the town actually calculated the increases that the expenses for the mandate would bring into town, like the schools. Will the schools have to expand? Will the schools have to hire more teachers? How much more cost that would be? You have sewage here, I assume?
No.
So it's all septic, right? And then you still have to anticipate if your water supply is good or not, even though it's all, I assume wells or reservoirs? What do you, wells, okay. So you have to assume that's adequate, and your fire department, you gotta see if that's adequate, your police department, and your town population, I'm sorry to ask you questions, but
12,000.
12,000, so 700 units, you're talking a sizable percentage. I mean,
We've proactively asked all the department heads to provide us with a rough estimate calculation of what it would do to their staffing levels.
Mhm.
Every single one of them had indicated that, of course, they would need to increase staffing levels to support a development of this kind. Fair, Town Manager Sweet?
Yes,
Is that a
that's
fair
it.
statement?
Yes.
Excellent. Most towns have not even done that, really.
We presented that in our last meeting.
That's excellent, because for your people to make the right decisions, they have to know the ramifications, the costs, and so forth. And I bet you money that all the grants that that dwarfed the grants that you've gotten, at least the average grants that you've gotten thus far. Anyway, let's get a little more into that. You guys have done it, truthfully, your town administration has done an excellent job in presenting and looking into matters. On the whole, in general, most towns have not. Okay, so I think you're very lucky, personally, to have the people you have here, because they thought about it, and they have thought about it, they actually did some figuring and to present you a better picture. Anyway, before I turn over to Attorney Walsh, I just want to go over a few things I'd like you to think about. Do we really have a housing shortage that is claimed? Or is there really just a shortage of affordable housing? Okay, that's a question that definitely I think is not being answered. The state has claimed that the mandate was voted by a large majority of the state representatives. That is a fact, but the majority vote was for a very large spending bill. Probably thousands of pages long, I would guess, and probably it wasn't voted for this mandate, it was voted for the spending bill. The mandate itself was only 3 small paragraphs buried in this gigantic bill that I'm sure probably no one read it. However, it has since grown to 40 pages of the guidelines, and that's what the towns are suffering from, the guidelines. Again, bureaucratic control and changes. Because of the mass high taxes, shrinking manufacturing, job opportunities, intrusive government regulations, anti-small business policies, I believe a lot of tax-paying citizens are starting to move out of Massachusetts. I think it's like similar to California. And if that is correct, or even partially correct, why do we need 220,000, I think is the last unit I've heard, it as high as 300,000 units. And we've been forecasting more units than that. Why are they needed? The state currently claims to have a deficit of only $1 billion. Boston claims they are losing over $1 billion in tax money due to empty offices. I believe the state will eventually admit to an even greater deficit. Do you really think they will have any money for future grants even? You have to question that. If you approve this mandate and is later ruled illegal, your town may be stuck with complying with it anyway. So that you should consider, because it won't cost your town a lot of money, one way or the other, especially if you go with the mandate. If they approve this mandate, there will be a greater emphasis on relying more on the MBTA for travel than our cars. You think that's maybe a crazy statement, but they've floated a number of balloons about taxing your usage of cars, your mileage, and things along that line. So I don't think it's such a frivolous mention that this could be a reality. So can the MBTA even improve or become economically sound enough to compensate for that? I doubt it. And if you have any questions by the end that we haven't addressed later, Karen is the person to go to. That's Karen over there. Raise your hand, Karen, so you know. And I'll let Attorney Walsh take it from here.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Well, sir.
I sure have.
Oh, okay.
Does that work? Okay, good. I'll take that.
Thanks, sir. Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Walsh. I'm an attorney. I should tell you I'm a partisan. I represent Mr. Kolakowski. He and 10 of his friends from the town of Rockport filed a suit against the town of Rockport when Rockport first went to comply with the MBTA mandate in 2022. This law was passed as part of an economic development bill. It was signed by Governor Baker in January of 2021. It was 192 pages, and there are only 3 short paragraphs, as you've already heard. The short paragraphs are designed to spur housing production. The law itself is very simple. It says that every city and town of the 177 MBTA communities, which are defined in the MBTA statute, Chapter 161A, have to have a district of reasonable size within half a mile of mass transit, be it ferry, boat, subway, train, what have you. And then some towns. It also applies to towns that are adjacent towns, like Wrentham or like Linfield, that aren't directly served by mass transit, normally the commuter rail, but sometimes the bus. You're also subject to compliance. The law afforded to the administrative agencies of the state, the State Housing Department, the State Department of Transportation, and the MBTA, the right to erect guidelines to determine compliance of this district of reasonable size. And this district of reasonable size, whatever it is, has to allow for high-dense housing. It has to allow 15 units per acre. If you think about that, that means if you put a triple-decker on quarter-acre lots back-to-back, that's still not enough housing to comply with this. And so this is designed to allow high-dense housing. Could I have the next slide, please? When we argue that Rockport shouldn't be complying with this law, we've argued that primarily that it's unconstitutional in the state constitution. Article 89 of, here's the law. There are 177 cities, this is the district, and then next slide, please. If you don't comply, the short answer is that in the text of the law, you're no longer eligible to comply with 3 or 4 specific grants. There's the Housing Choice Initiative, there's Mass Works, there's the New Housing Works, and then there's a 4th one who I don't presently remember. This is the actual text of the law. It's only 3 paragraphs. It's moderately simple, but unfortunately the guidelines, because there have been a lot of the State Housing Department is weighing a lot of factors and trying to determine what it thinks is both fair for municipalities and will spur housing production to address population needs. The guidelines have expanded rather substantially. They've revised them 5 times in the 2 years the law has been in effect. One of the first things to know, this is actually a snippet out of the guidelines, is that Section 3A does not include any express requirement or authorization for an MBTA community to require affordable units. This is not an affordable housing law. It was sold to the legislature that way, and it was sold to the people that way, but because it proved uneconomic to have affordable housing restrictions in, the state housing department decided to decouple the affordability from it. You could draw a perfectly complying Section 3A district that has zero affordable housing. You could literally be talking about 750 market rate townhouses or other apartments that have nothing to do with affordable housing and will not help people who need to be able to buy houses. The story we're often told is that our kids or our sons or people who move in from college can't afford to stay here and so they leave. This is not in any sense a solution to that problem. This just spurs the production of housing. Next slide, please. So the primary argument we're making in our lawsuit is that we're arguing that this is unconstitutional under Article 89 of the amendments to the state constitution. Article 89 is what's called the Home Rule Amendment. It was enacted in 1966 by the voters overwhelmingly. I think it was 1.2 million to about 200,000. Before the Home Rule Amendment went into effect, we were governed by what was called Dillon's Law, which was named after a early 1900 Supreme Court case, which the Supreme Court said, drawing back to the common law in England, that any kind of local government you can think of, counties, regional school districts, towns, are simply creatures of the state to be amended, altered, torn apart, redesigned, and essentially to serve the legislature's whim at whatever the legislature wants. The voters get tired of that, and so they enacted the Home Rule Amendment. The Home Rule Amendment is a political scientist dream. It is terribly boring for the average voter. It deals a lot with the structure of the town and how much the legislature can alter your structure of government. But one of the things it does is it contains a repository. It gives cities and towns an independent right to use what's called the state police power.
Can't hear you.
Pardon, sorry.
The mic doesn't,
Not working?
no, it's not a mic for the
Oh,
room, it's a mic for the cable.
Ah,
So-
so you got two mics.
Yeah,
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay.
are you saying the residents can't hear him?
Yeah,
So if you could either come forward or he could speak up a little bit.
I can talk up. I'm quite happy to. I'll boom as
Please do that.
I'll boom as loud as you want me to.
And also, if you want them to slow down, ask them to slow down.
If there are any court reporters in the room, just give up. They think I talk way too fast anyway. This center article is actually a quote out of the Section 1 of the Home Rule Amendment. It says, the Home Rule Amendment is adopted to reaffirm the traditional and customary liberties of the people with respect to their local government and to grant and confirm to the people of every city and town the right of self-government in local matters. This essentially is your right to local self-government. If you want to be trendy like Brookline and you want to ban nip bottles or plastic shopping bags, you can do that. If you want to be a pro-business fishing port like Gloucester, you can do that. This is what lets your town customize its localities, its properties, its zoning values, its businesses, as well as the general conduct of, if you want to be a loud, raucous party town, you can do that. If you want to be a quiet, single-family acre zoning town, you can do that too. That's your vote. That's the choice of you and your local officials. Slide, please. In Section 6 of the Home Rule Amendment, it confers what we've referred to as the independent municipal powers. These are powers that the town has, the town can exercise irrespective of what the legislature does. Normally speaking, the authorization to have zoning comes in two flavors. One is power that's delegated by the state, but the other is the power that you have under the state's Home Rule Amendment. We've taken the position that because this MBTA zoning law tells cities and towns what they must do, that it's trying to commandeer the cities and towns and force them to use their zoning power in a way that some of them don't want to or may not be wise for their city or town. And so we're arguing that this is an unconstitutional infringement of the right to local self-government. These are a number of cases from the early days of the Home Rule Amendment from the 1970s. These are quotes that confirm clearly, beyond all doubt, that zoning is an inherently local power, it belongs in the Home Rule Amendment, and therefore you can't be compelled to do it. As far as we can tell, looking through the case laws, this is the first time since the Home Rule Amendment was passed that the legislature has ever tried to tell cities or towns that they must do something that is within their exclusive local power. One of the things the Home Rule Amendment did, because it undid the Dillon Rule, is it changed the balance of power between governments. You may remember, dating back to middle school civics, that we have different separate branches of government to ensure that no person or entity has too much power, and by dividing up the power, we theoretically create more freedom, or so the Supreme Court cases tell us. The Supreme Court cases also tell us, federal Supreme Court cases also tell us the same is true when we divide power between state and federal governments, and so it shan't surprise you that the same is also true on the municipal level. Dividing power between the federal and state, or the state and local governments, is one of the checks on your freedom, because your vote counts more in a town meeting where there's only 1 of 100 or 1 of 1,000 of you than in a state where you vote where there's 1 of 8 million of you. And it also allows you to customize your locality, to answer local problems with local solutions, and so you don't get stuck with some big one-size-fits-all federal playbook. One of the other arguments that we're making is, and this is more a political argument than a legal one, is that the sacrifices that you would make as your town to conform to this MBTA zone are not worth it. These are numbers from the Department of Revenue's Division of Local Services for Wrentham for the last 15 years. This is the whole thing, but I actually blew up the 2 columns over on the right-hand side. These are the state aid numbers, which are not all of the state money that you get, but it's the bulk of the state money that you get from any kind of program that you can imagine. And then on the right-hand side are your total receipts, which have in the last 15 years gone from 34 million down to 62 million. Compared to that, your actual receipts from the state have remained relatively constant at about 5 million. When I went into Ipswich looking at these numbers, but the grants that you are eligible to apply for typically only account for between 2 to 5% of that state aid number. So that state aid number, that 5.5 million more or less, is nothing like the kind of grants that you're looking at. You're essentially talking about more or less pocket change. When I was in Ipswich, their numbers were so low, I got to tell them it was cushions in the couch kind of change. So the short answer is that we wanted to argue to you that it's not a real impact. It's not. Now, some places the governor has made comments to indicate that if you don't comply, they're going to really come after towns that don't comply. She's argued. The attorneys haven't argued, but the governor has argued that they may come after school money or road money. As any of you may have studied this, the foundation budgets for schools and the Chapter Road 90 money is done on a formula basis. You know, the formula has to do with the number of road miles you have, and you know, whether you have double streets with double yellow lines or not, they count differently. There is no, those are separate laws. Those are separate funding formulas. There is no implication that without another vote of another law of both houses of the legislature that the governor can in any way, shape, or form attack road or school money. And those road or school money form the overwhelming amount of money that your town gets from the state every year. Rolled into the state is also school lunch money, and it's a lot of other things, some of which come from the federal government under its own programs. So the amount of money that's at stake here is a very small slice of a very small piece of the small aid that you get. You are, in terms of your state aid, you are overwhelmingly self-sufficient compared to many of the cities and towns that we've been in. One of the other arguments that we've made is that the guidelines are problematic. For those of you who are lawyers in the room, the state has what we call Administrative Procedures Act. A regulation is any kind of a law, a guideline, a rate set by an agency for energy or what have you that's set, and it has to go through a public notice and comment period. The State Housing Department, when this law went into effect, was very happy to see that the legislature used the word guidelines because they've assumed that this is not subject to Chapter 30A. For whatever reason, they don't want to be subject to public input and criticism and comment. They don't want to be subject to judicial review. A lot of this analysis was put out in a memo by the Milton Planning Board chairman, was a attorney by the name of Alex Whiteside before he died. He was also the general counsel to the State Housing Department, and he wrote a rather lengthy memo that if you haven't seen, I highly recommend. And he says that one of the things that the State Housing Department is afraid of is scrutiny, because if you're a state agency and you go to adopt a regulation, it takes months to do. You have to take public comment, and you can't just fob it off. It's not like I come to a meeting, I hear the angry voters, and then I ignore them. I have to put in writing the reasons why the voters' suggestions I don't want to accept. I have to actually engage in a process. With guidelines like these, they can just change them at a whim. Matter of fact, they've done it several times already, and there's no reason to believe that they won't do it. In the approval letter that Mr. Kolakowski was taking for Lexington and Salem and a couple of other towns that have already complied and received their compliance checkoffs by both the Attorney General and the State Housing Department, the State Housing Department said, well, we reserve the right to change the guidelines, and if you change your zone, you have to let us know, and you have to keep us informed, and if you don't, you may fall out of compliance anyway. I should also tell you that compliance, even if you intend to do this, even if you think this is the greatest idea since sliced bread, it is ridiculously hard to do. Our original suit against the town of Rockport was filed in the State Superior Court. It was filed in 2022 after Rockport enacted what they called the Transportation-Oriented Village Overlay District. That district was 32 or so acres, and it was too small. They have had to go back again this May and draw another district that's bigger to comply, even though they were trying very hard and they hired the consultant that the state recommended, the compliance model, and everything else under the green sun, and it still wasn't any good. The state made them go back and do it again. That's why you may have seen in the newspaper about Rockport residents filing a suit. In response to the new MBTA zoning district, we filed a second suit. This one is in federal court. In terms of one of the other things that we object to about this law is that you may be familiar with in politics, increasingly it's becoming true that if you don't like the result, the answer is to change the process to make it easier. So one of the things the Economic Development Bill did is it said that if you want to adopt one of the legislature's 4 preferred pro-housing policies, you, instead of having to go through a 2/3 majority at town meeting, you only need a simple majority. But this is only to opt in, not to change it, not to leave it, just to opt in. The 4 housing priorities are if you want to adopt a Chapter 40R district, which is a special kind of negotiated zoning that's pro-housing and mixed use. If you want to adopt a starter home district, if you want to adopt MBTA zoning, and there are a couple of other programs buried in there. But the short answer is that we've now said that if you want to create housing productions, we'll make it easier for you to slide it past town meeting, but not if you want to change it, adopt it, or amend it. In terms of consequences, all of you will have heard the town of Milton is getting sued. It's actually pending in the state Supreme Court right now. The state Supreme Court is hearing arguments in October. In the first week of October, they're going to hear arguments about how the law should be interpreted vis-a-vis the guidelines. They're also going to hear whether or not the Attorney General has any power to even bring the kind of suits at all. The Attorney General is viewing this in the mold of the 1970s busing issues and has asked the state Supreme Court to appoint a special master who is basically a kind of appointed referee who will come in, draw districts against Milton's consent, and in law impose them even though the voters voted against it. It's very undemocratic, and that was part of the downfall of the busing case law in the 1970s, and it isn't clear that the Attorney General even has that authority. So of the 2 questions that were certified for review to the state Supreme Court, one of them is, does the Attorney General have any right to ask for any of these kinds of remedies? Generally speaking, normally speaking, we interpret statutes using a series of tools called the canons of statutory construction. One of them is, forgive me, my Latin's terrible, it's something like expressio unis alteris exclusus. The expression of one thing is the exclusion of all others. So if I create a law and it says draw a district, and if you don't, you're ineligible for 4 grants of money, and the State Housing Department, the MBTA, and the Department of Transportation are the only ones who can enforce it, what business is it of the Attorney General's? More importantly, what business is it of the State Housing Department? You see, there are only 4 grants that are listed in the law, but all of the folks who are in favor of this have been carting around slides that were generated, I believe, by MAPC, but I couldn't swear to it, that have a list of 17 buckets of money. And that's because the State Housing Department has said that if you don't comply, we're going to hold it against you in other grant programs, in other discretionary grant programs, because you're not being pro-housing, we're going to really sock it to you if we can. This is stuff that's designed to be forward-thinking for municipalities, things like vulnerability assessments, like climate change resiliency studies. These are things that are designed to help you pay for consultants and other things to look forward, and if you're not pro-housing, we're going to cut you off from those sources of funding. One of the other arguments we're making against the law is that it violates the Unfunded Mandates Act. I assume, like every urban voter there ever was, you're all familiar with Proposition 2.5. This is essentially a law that says that without a ballot vote, town meeting can't allow the property taxes to go up by more than 2.5% per year. Part of the deal was that the state would no longer impose costs on municipalities. So if the legislature passes a law that puts a cost on a municipality and then they don't fund it under Chapter 29, Section 27C, it doesn't go into effect as a matter of law. You can actually do this, enforce this either through a suit by 10 taxpayers. There happen to be 10 folks in Rockport who are arguing this. But also, if you have a municipal official who is brave enough to sign a letter to say that we think this is a problem, you can actually ask the state auditor to find that a particular law doesn't comply with the unfunded mandates law, and the state auditor is entitled to certify that it doesn't comply and just rule it out of compliance. In support of this argument, one of the things is that the state has made, since November of 2022, has made available technical assistance grants. In addition to a big compliance model, there are a number of, in the guidelines, there are a number of ornery requirements that basically require the hiring of a consultant, or else you have to have a big, fully staffed municipal urban planning department. And the cost in some cases is prohibitive to comply. Otherwise, you end up like Rockport trying to comply once or twice. And so these technical assistant grants are trying to help cities and towns hire consultants to help them comply. But one of the things that we're arguing is that if you need a consultant to comply and you need a grant to hire the consultant to comply, this clearly is an unfunded mandate. Other than that, we're arguing that it's unfair that the guidelines are subject to change, that you should know what the rules are, and they shouldn't be able to change without public input. And we've made a few other arguments of that general ilk. One thing I wanted to note is that you guys have one of the most active and vocal boards in the entire Commonwealth on this issue. Not to say that they're necessarily opposed to it, but they have looked very hard about its impact on your town. They've written several letters to the state that have gotten a lot of headlines. They've asked for waivers. They've asked for alterations to the mechanism. Do you really need to suffer 750 units? Could it be smaller? They've asked for waivers. They've been very vocal about trying to mitigate its impact, particularly its fiscal impact on your city and town and your way of life here. And so they get a gold star for that. Forgive me, the picture of Nancy Reagan is a little gratuitous. Normally, see, one of the things is that when it says a city or town shall draw, it requires a vote of the local legislative assembly, which in towns like yours with an open town meeting, I believe, that is you, the voters. So essentially, you have to vote this in. Even under the best conception, you have to vote this in. There is no indication that anyone can force you, and if you turn out and vote no, other than the Attorney General making a lot of racket, and it's not clear that she can, we'll see what happens with the Milton suit, and potentially losing some grants that may or may not be pocket change, there isn't a lot of downside. There are actually some folks who are very pro-affordable housing, because we do have a huge affordability crisis, that are just offended because they think that this law, A, it isn't aimed at affordable housing, and B, it detracts from their efforts, because instead of pouring resources into trying to create housing for the young families or the college students or the workers who move into Massachusetts, we're instead creating lots more market rate housing. And generally speaking, the academic studies show that density does not decrease. Even though normally supply and demand, the more there is of something, the less it costs, generally speaking, as to housing density, that's not true. With housing density, the closer you are, the more packed in you are, the more expensive it gets. I don't know why. It's a well-known phenomenon, and the academics argue about the effect of it. The Man in the Arena. Those of you may remember there's a quote from a 1906 Teddy Roosevelt speech about the man in the arena. It is not the critic who counts, but rather the man in the arena, whose face is marred with blood and sweat, who tries, who strives, who comes up short time and time again, but who goes out and strives. Your selectmen and your town government have been doing that. Oftentimes we go into towns and we're talking to voters and we're talking around the backs of their municipal officials. I'm always up for a good town hall of terrible story, and the jokes write themselves. But in your particular case, that's not true. Your selectmen and your town officials have been out front in this. Even whether you think the law is a good idea or not, they have been a very careful approach. They've been looking at a lot of data. They've been looking at all the guidelines from the state. They've been looking at its local cost. And so for whatever it's worth, I just wanted to give your local officials a lot of props for that. So this is a list, as far as I know, of the cities and towns that have either voted MBTA zoning down or have decided to punt the ball. Now, part of the reason this is a little funky is because the State Housing Department figured that when this law came into effect, there was no way to put it into effect immediately, so they phased it in. They divided the cities and towns up into different types, and what type of town, whether you were a high-speed rail district town like Milton, or whether you're an adjacent community like Wrentham and Linfield, or whether you're an inner city served by subway. It has different impacts as to when you're supposed to comply, and also how much housing you're supposed to offer up under this mandate. There are 130 of the 177 towns that have to comply this year. I'm not sure if Wrentham is one of them, but a number of towns have looked at this and said no. Several others have decided to punt. Part of the reason that you're seeing some kickback from the Attorney General and the Governor have been out arguing everybody's complied. The reason they can say everybody's complied is because there's a 5-page form that if you want to comply in the interim, because these are grants, they're funding rounds, they go yearly. So if I'm going to take 4 or 5 years to implement this mandate, how do I know in the interim, in 2023 and 2024, who to give the grants to? And the way the state decided to do that was that if you filled out a 5-page form and you created a plan of how you were going to get to compliance, they would check you off as compliant in the short term, and that's what's allowed the Governor and the Attorney General to go around and say 175 of 177 towns are in compliance. It does not indicate a lot of local buy-in by voters, by town meetings, by city councils, by elected officials. It means that someone in town hall, not even necessarily an elected official, sometimes just a town planner doing her job in an office, can fill out a 5-page form and send it to the state, and that will qualify for the interim compliance model. So one of the other arguments, the two that haven't complied are Milton, because they voted it down at the ballot. They actually have a limited town meeting that voted it up, although the folks in East Milton were outraged, and then they were able to get enough signatures to force a referendum on the limited town meeting's vote, and that's where the folks in East Milton came out and really socked it at the polls. The other one that's out of compliance is Holden. The town manager in Holden is an attorney. He thinks that this is a terrible law, and he is willing to fight it. He actually has already been sued in the Worcester Superior Court by a couple of housing think tanks, and he beat it on standing. And he basically has said, come and get me. He doesn't think this is cool. It doesn't fit in his town. It doesn't fit in his town's affordable housing plans. His town is busy looking at how to comply with 40B and how to take care of his citizens, and more or less doesn't have time for what he perceives to be nonsense. My favorite quote is that after the Milton vote, the Attorney General sued, essentially looking to undo a Democratic vote in Milton, and the Holden guy said, we live in a democracy, I don't think you can do that. So forgive me, I happen to think he's like a rock star. So Wakefield has voted it down in the last couple of weeks, as has Marblehead. Littleton voted a version of it down, I think, last fall. They're a little funky. For those who know, under Chapter 40A, Section 5, that's the process by which you adopt zoning laws. If you vote down an article, it cannot come back within 2 years unless your planning board says yes. And so Littleton voted it down with the express intention of locking themselves out of compliance. Holden, of course, hasn't even voted it down because they haven't brought it to ballot and they don't intend to. Wrentham, your selectmen, I wouldn't say opposed, but they have been resisting. They've been getting information. They've been seeing how much is required, what the cost is, and weighing the ups and downs. Marshfield's voted it down. Some of the towns on the bottom and right-hand side actually haven't voted it down. In the no column, they've just voted to postpone it. In some cases, the postponement would put them in non-compliance with the rotating deadlines. In some cases, it just kicks it down the can down the road while they wait and see what happens with the state Supreme Court case in Milton. But Norwell, Handsome, and Rowley are all in the last couple of weeks. Middleborough is not exactly a quantum. They actually, believe it or not, held out with Holden, and they initially refused to fill out the 5-page form. They have a brilliant affordable housing production plan. They've got an affordable housing trust. They've got a dense downtown that they're already looking on how to do it, and they've got it planned. And so they were rather offended the state was coming in and telling them you need more housing on top of what you've already agreed to. Matter of fact, the state came out and agreed to sort of bend the rules a little bit to sort of allow them to come in compliance without really coming into compliance. So Middleborough is more on the foot-dragging end. There are also cities and towns that have been looking at what they call paper compliance. This is the idea that you draw a district that in paper, in theory, complies, but in practical effect, it doesn't work. For example, there was a guy in Manchester who was thinking, oh, we ought to draw it around the town dump or in the graveyard. Those are brilliant ideas, but I'll tell you that the state housing department folks are not stupid. They've been around the block before. What they've recently done, in the last year and a half or so, they've created 2 sliding metrics. Now you have to have so much density, units per acre, and you also have to have so much acreage allowed to qualify. And as part of the acreage calculation, they now say that you only have to have 40% of your 40% of your acreage that is covered by this law within the half-mile radius around the train, or if you're a city or town that is not directly serviced by a train or within half a mile of a train, you can actually put the district anywhere in town under the current guidelines. But they've allowed you to average them. So part of what they've done is they've created excluded land calculus. They've excluded, for example, land belonging to municipalities. They've excluded ocean. They've excluded graveyards and dumps. They haven't excluded churches. I don't know quite what to think about that, but they've excluded colleges and other institutions that essentially are not apt to change. So the folks at the State Housing Department have a mission. Their job is to produce housing. They're working at it every day, 40 days a week, or 40 hours a week, and they're not stupid. They're working actively at this. This law is not particularly aimed at affordable housing, as I mentioned earlier, but other than that, Tewksbury, Hanson, Hanover, and Hopkinton are all towns that have either voted it down or have voted to postpone it by sending it back to the planning board for further review. Sending it back to the planning board for further review doesn't lock you out of compliance like Littleton, where they affirmatively voted it down on purpose. It just sends it back for more study. In your case, you have proactive town officials that are already working on that. Do I have one more slide? I was also asked to write a short chart to compare 40A to 40B. Most cities and towns are still struggling to comply with 40B. Forgive me, I am a NIMBY. My first experience going to town hall at all of 11 years old was to fight a 40B development in our backyard. So I am a snob in the anti-snob zoning law, and I am a NIMBY. Actually, for those of you who read the planning journals, the new term isn't NIMBY, it's actually banana, which is build absolutely nothing anywhere near anything. So I'm probably one of those too. When I got onto the Linfield Housing Board in 2014, there were only 13 of the 351 cities and towns subject to 40B that had complied or were in the process of complying. As of June of 2023, the number is now 72. And most of those are in eastern Massachusetts, where there's already a lot of infrastructure and it's highly dense, and so it's where the developers would get the best margins on their 40B developments. Now, increasingly less urban, more suburban, even more rural towns are starting to see the impact of 40B. But from the developer's perspective, a lot of the best and highest margins of return are already in the rearview mirror. If you were a skeptic, you might even say that 40B had run half its course, or perhaps even was up on the peak and coming down the backside. And if I were a developer or in the developer lobby, I'd be looking for the next best thing, and this is pretty close. So 40B says that if your town is not up to 10% affordable housing, then a developer can come in and essentially preempt your local zoning. But it's not a cashless process. You still have the ability to grip with it. Your ZBA, among other things, is allowed to impose conditions like traffic conditions, parking conditions, water and sewer. There actually were a couple of 40Bs that actually got beaten by cities and towns because they had independent water or sewer boards that were not subject to the same promises that the town under 40B can be forced to make. Also, if you get up over the 40B threshold, you can be exempt. 72 of the towns either are or have plans to be exempt. You can also, if you have a 40R development, I don't recommend them because it's a negotiated zoning. Your poor town official sits at the table with the developer, his highly paid attorney, his engineer, his traffic engineer. You negotiate a package, and then it's fixed, and it can't change without three-party consent, developer, town, and state. Linfield, if any of you have been on the North Shore, Market Street up on 128 is a 40R development. The only thing resisting the 40R we were able to do is we were able to exclude the movie theater. They came back to us 7 times to ask for the movie theater, and when it eventually became clear that they were never going to get town meetings permission, much less state permission, they just dropped it. But I don't recommend 40R, although for those of you who are municipal officials, you'll know that if you adopt 40R, there is also 40S, which is a short-term cash payment for 2.5 years to try and mitigate the impact on your schools if new students come in. Generally speaking, with 40A, or with 40B, it's still a site-by-site guidelines. You still have the ability to impact. Under 40A, if you're in one of these districts, wherever it's drawn, it's just as of right zoning. Whatever parcels are in, whoever buys the house and knocks it down can build whatever they want to build, up to the minimum of 15 units per acre. There's no ability to say no. Some cities and towns trying to argue that they can minimize or soften the impact on their towns have touted what's called site plan review. Site plan review is a custom that has grown up in planning circles where to make sure your building is set far enough back from the street, it's not too tall, very basic stuff like the basic geography, the kind of stuff that you could do on the back of a paper napkin. Even in as of right, you're highly encouraged, but in many places, site plan review is not required. And there are some arguments in some cases that suggest that you don't even actually really need to, as a developer, submit to even that bare minimum impact. So the only kinds of impacts that your town will be able to use to soften or control 40A when it comes into effect, you can still regulate height as long as it's not unfeasible. You can still, you're allowed to put in a 40B 10% restriction. If you want to go above the 10% restriction, let's suppose you don't want to just tread water on 40B, let's suppose you want to make ground. In order to go above the 10% threshold on 40A, you have to hire a consultant and do a feasibility study and make sure that you're not going to put the developer to too much trouble if you make him give over 20% of the units to 40B affordability. The other thing about 40A is that because it's impacted and because it goes through the ZBA process and it's subject to local conditions, anything is in the public interest, and it can still be appealed, yes, to the state, and maybe they can preempt the zoning, but it requires a lot of front-end work. It requires a lot of study by lawyers and engineers. Your town has a voice into it. Your ability, not necessarily able to fight it, but certainly able to control the spin of the ball and maybe mitigate the loss, so to speak. In 40A, you have no rights to do that. It is of right. The developer comes in and can build whatever his pocketbook and his land will allow him to build. And that more or less was everything I had to say, unless anybody had any questions.
Attorney Walsh, I'll ask a question if I could.
By all means.
There's been, some of the residents asked us about if we were to vote this in at town meeting, and then it was determined later on that this is in fact unconstitutional, unenforceable, what would that look like to zone it out once it's already zoned in?
To zone it out, you would require a 2/3 majority at town meeting. And because you would have locally opted into it under your Article 89, Section 6 power, even if the state can't constitutionally make you do it, if you have already inflicted the injury on yourselves, you are stuck with it. There are some people who, the Attorney General, in response to our lawsuit, has argued, among other things, that they are the supreme power and the legislature could go out and just draw these districts itself. But I think it's telling that they haven't, either because of the cost or because they know that they can't draw local solutions, or maybe just because they want local buy-in. They're asking you to do it. And constitutionally, they can't make you do it, although they're certainly trying. And that's sort of where the line is. The Attorney General would just as soon say that I can make you get to the same outcome anyway, and so it makes no difference. But I'll tell you, even if you accept the Attorney General's argument on its own face, which I don't, it's still the difference between being asked to walk to the gallows or being asked to build your own gallows. And there is some amount of pride and dignity and freedom in not having to build your own gallows.
So would it be recommended that if we put an article through that is it dated December 31st?
You can certainly do that, yes. I suspect, and this is pure prognostication, reading tea leaves, that the Attorney General, that the state Supreme Court will try and have a decision out after their October argument before the compliance deadline. Sometimes when the state Supreme Court is in a hurry, they issue what they call a rescript opinion, where they give a short line. It's basically like reading the box scores in the newspaper the next day. It doesn't tell you the play-by-play about who won and why, but it tells you who won. And so I suspect that there will be a rescript that comes out pretty quickly following the October arguments, well in advance of the December deadline. So if you were prepared to have a meeting in December, I suspect that would cover you and allow you to see what happens with Milton, Supreme Court case. I know several of the towns up on the list that have kicked their articles back to the planning board are exactly hoping and waiting to see what happens with Milton.
So if we held our vote, so if we held our vote, say, in September, and had the article effective December 31st, that would still accomplish the same goal, even if, right, if the town voted at that time but said it would be effective December 31st? Or should we hold our vote for the town until December?
So general bylaws normally don't go into effect until 90 days after they're enacted, after the Attorney General has reviewed them in place. There is a similar review process for zoning bylaws, but the funky thing about zoning bylaws is that once it's signed off, we normally, unless you specify otherwise, retroactively date the bylaws' effect on individual pieces of private property back to the date of town meeting. So, as in to say that, the question is who runs first the building inspector's office to pull a permit. Yes, that certainly would be one way of doing it, but I would tend to recommend more if it wasn't going to be too much of a cost to your town. And I know holding town meetings is expensive. You got to have fire departments, police officials, you got to get all your town officials together, you got to pull all the voters out, you got to notify everybody. It's not an easy process. But to the extent that you can push your town meeting later out to try and see what happens to Milton, I would certainly encourage that. The problem if you hold your vote in September and then you delay the implementation date is what happens if it turns out that you were right and that it shouldn't have gone into effect. If you do nothing or can't get your act together, then you're still stuck with it. It does give you a window to try and pull the plug, but it may be a hurried pulling of the plug, which, I mean, it's not unreasonable. It's not a bad strategy at all. It just, certainly want to push it. It's not a bad idea to wait and see what happens with Milton. This is a new law. It's since 1966, we've never seen anything like it where the state has tried to co-opt cities and towns to do something. And so waiting to see what the state Supreme Court does is, I think, the smarter money for all concerned.
I'd like to see if Selectman Anderson has any questions to ask. I'll ask the board to say anything, but then we'll open it up to the public to see if anyone has any questions.
Yes, Attorney Walsh, one of my concerns is that under the law, right, so there is no affordability factor, correct? Can the town put some type of affordability into that development?
Yes.
Okay.
You have the option to go up to put a 10% affordability component on your article with no questions asked. The state housing department has already pre-approved that. If you go higher than 10%, they will require that you do a feasibility study, an economic feasibility study, and they have a pre-approved list of consultants. And unlike the 20 consultants who will help you draw the district of the feasibility study, I think there are only 3 that are able to do the economic feasibility study. It is an option. I do say that this isn't an affordable housing law, but you can put a piece into it. They did it in Rockport when they just adopted it. Matter of fact, they did it on the fly over the objection of the planning board, and the voters wanted it anyway.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
Selectman Harrington, do you have any questions?
No, not at this time.
Town Manager Sweet, do you have any
Yeah, just a quick question. I wonder if you could unpack the requirement for essentially pre-town meeting review of the plan. So, I mean, obviously, you mentioned the law itself is about 3 paragraphs, right? We've done a lot of research on this and had a lot of conversation. And I'm still trying to get, and maybe we can look at specifically the communities that have already adopted it, but trying to understand, at least from your perspective, your interpretation of the requirements for the pre-review, where it's not a shall, as part of the law, but it's something that the Office of Housing and Livable Communities, which at the time was just Office of Housing and Economic Development, but they're sort of requiring this. But I guess still not real clear to me the interpretation, legal opinions on requirement versus guideline. And just if you could talk about that a little bit, because I'd like to get your perspective on the requirement aspect versus they just like you to do that.
So I will tell you that of the 70 some odd cities and towns that have looked at this in the spring of this year, more than half of them have not submitted even though they've adopted what they believe are complying articles, they have not submitted their articles for pre-review. The state housing guidelines under this law encourage you to submit your article to the state housing department for pre-clearance review 90 days before your town meeting vote, and then they'll get back to you ahead of time and tell you if they think it complies. Meaning, of course, that they can't still forecast what town meeting does. If town meeting, like in Rockport, wants to, on the fly, add an affordable housing component to it, you may be out of trouble. In terms of the may and the shall, that goes back to the Administrative Procedures Act. Attorney Whiteside took the position, as do I, that it has any requirements to be binding and have force and effect of law as defined in Chapter 30A, Section 1, that's the Administrative Procedures Act, have to go through a notice and public comment period and otherwise aren't binding law because it's a guideline. We assume that a guideline is best operating practices, not you must do this. And so the State Housing Department has certainly been trying to put as much starch into those guidelines to make them look like nice stiff shirts as they can. In terms of what the effect is, no one really knows. I will tell you that even the people that think this is a great idea and have signed on and are doing it, many of them still didn't bother or didn't have enough time to comply with pre-clearance review, so it appears that the guidelines are squishy except where the State Housing Department cares about them. In terms of their ability to hold you in non-compliance for not substantive reasons, but for procedural reasons, I would tell you, uninformed opinion, as an opponent, that I think that it's absolutely meaningless. I think if you don't comply, but you still draw a complying district, I think you're all set.
At this time, open it up to any questions from the public. Go right ahead.
Yes, I have a question to follow up on Selectman Anderson's question. That was about the affordability. Our town is close, I think, if not already at the 10% requirement by Chapter 40B. And my question is, if we go ahead and put a 10% affordability requirement into the bylaw and it were passed, would that affordability requirement allow us to stay in compliance with the requirements of Chapter 40B? Would they count towards that same standard?
Yes. So the definition of affordable in both the statute and in the guidelines says that if you require it to be affordable, and there are a myriad of ways that they do that. Some are by deed restrictions, some of them are by permit condition. Yes, you could put a 10% on, and mathematically that would keep you at the same level or tread water, and you would still be in compliance.
And I have a follow-up question to Selectman Gallo's question about passing it and the state Supreme Judicial Court makes a ruling and so forth. What happens then? As I understand it, if we pass a bylaw, it is then in effect, and you use the term, we're stuck with it. But I'm wondering if it's true that we're stuck with it until we rescind it. Now, to pass it, we just need a simple majority. But if we wanted to remove it at a future town meeting, would require a 2/3 vote, at which point it could be rescinded. But until that time, the town is susceptible to somebody coming in and putting in a plan and build it right and go forward. But until that, if we pass it later on, then it goes away. Is that right?
That is 90% true. The only hook is that after the zoning bylaws by Chapter 40, Section 32 have to get signed off by the Attorney General. City council ordinances do not. We assume that city councils have big city halls and they're well-staffed with lawyers and they know what they're doing. Us poor bumpkins in towns, we have to have our bylaws signed off by the Attorney General. And if the Attorney General doesn't sign off on it, or if you object to it, or whatever have you, that may stop the bylaw from going into effect, even though town meeting has voted it. Other than that, I will tell you your summation was perfectly accurate.
Also, if they already have the plans put in place, right?
Oh, my colleague here is trying to tell me that, let's suppose you pass it, and then I'm a developer and I own a parcel, and I run down to the building inspector's office. Then, even if you're not in compliance for purposes of the grants, if the Attorney General checks off on it so the bylaw legally goes into effect, even if you later rescind it, as long as I get to the building inspector's office and pull my permit or submit my plan or site review or what have you, before then, I will be grandfathered in the window while it was legal.
Can you say that again, just to make sure that everyone understands? Slow. Loud.
Nice and slow. So 40B, if you pass a 40B bylaw at town meeting, and then it goes, assuming it's checked off by the Attorney General, you open a door. Even if you the very next day have a town meeting and you pull the plug on it and you undo it, as long as I got to some kind of a permitting or sufficient permission, and the case law is rife with what constitutes a sufficiently forward step by the developer, but basically if I pull a building permit, if I submit a plan for site review, if I submit any kind of a development plan to the planning board, or even just if I start to make construction efforts, if I pull an electrical inspection permit, that may be a sufficient step for construction that I would thereafter be grandfathered under the law that was in effect, even if it was only in effect for one day. Does that simplify the question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Yeah, I have a question. Our zoning bylaws reference Mass General Laws, Chapter 48, Chapter 41, in and out of the bylaws quite frequently. Couldn't you approve this zoning bylaw that actually has a reference to this MBTA Act and its constitutionality? So therefore, if it actually was deemed unconstitutional, it's actually written into the zoning bylaw that then the zoning bylaw would not be in effect.
Yes, you could. You could condition it upon the constitutionality of it. The only problem is that some of the arguments we're making, although the main one is a constitutional argument, the arguments about unfunded mandates and the arguments about the flexibility of the guidelines, those are all statutory arguments. And so, although it's theoretically possible to write a bylaw It's definitely possible to write a bylaw that's conditioned on constitutionality. And if the SJC does or anything with that, you would be protected. It's a lot harder to write a bylaw that's conditioned upon the legality of a statute under laws like the unfunded mandate law or Chapter 30A, the Administrative Procedures Act. It's kind of like squaring, it raises the level of difficulty about conditioning your bylaw enormously. It's not impossible, and a creative attorney could do it for you. So it's not impossible at all. I don't know how good your guy is or how much confidence you have. It's certainly something to look at.
Any other questions? Could you ask the mic? Just, it's not for.
I had a question.
Oh, go ahead. Well, then, ask your question,
Okay,
please.
sorry. I greatly apologize if this was covered before I came in. What is the percentage of affordable housing we have in Wrentham, and what percentage of that percentage is elderly versus everything else? Because historically, suburbs and small towns go for the elderly housing because everyone's going to become old, but no one wants to become poor. And I'm wondering what percentage of our affordable housing, maybe you all would know, I should know, but I don't, is affordable housing in the town of Wrentham, and how much of that is for family and others?
I regret to say that I didn't pull Wrentham's numbers in terms of 40A before I ask someone who might know you a more specific answer. The answer is that when you're a town that's not in compliance with 40B, you want...
We're not compliant with 40B.
I believe that you are.
We are. That's what I'm asking.
So Wrentham is above the 10%. It's determined on the SHI. I don't know our exact SHI. It's 10.8 or close to 11, something like that. Nor do I have the exact breakdown of age restricted or something like that. We certainly have that, but we are in what they refer to as safe harbor by being on our 10% threshold. Of course, as you add more market rate units without affordable,
Right.
that drops down to your Exactly.
I was
Yeah.
just curious because I know that Emerald Court, I believe it's called, is a very small family section, and it seems like the vast majority is elder housing. So
Correct. Yeah, and those are under the control of the Wrentham Housing Authority, which is a separate quasi agency related
Right,
to the HUD standard, but it goes into the
it goes
numbers.
into the
Yes,
figure, doesn't it?
Yes.
that's correct.
Yeah.
Yep.
Thank you.
Although I should also tell you that under 40A, you're theoretically not supposed to restrict the 40A housing by age. Back when Linfield was not yet compliant with 40B, the first thing we did was we had elderly housing because there was going to be no impact on the schools, and this law is designed to circumvent that. You don't necessarily have to worry about that if you're up over the 10% threshold, but this law is not friendly to those kinds of games. Yes, sir.
Yeah, and mine was related to your argument with regard to being able to make some type of contingency on the bylaw that goes to the constitutionality of this law, is if you were put that contingency on, does that eliminate the ability of the developer from running into your planning board or making some type of advancement toward?
So if you had a law that was going to affect upon a condition, the developer could go and try and preserve his date preference by rushing to the building inspector's office. But if the contingency didn't go into effect, then your law would basically self-delete for practical purposes, and he wouldn't be protected. But if the law didn't self-delete, then he'd be able to keep his affordability, his eligibility by date, even if you ran and repealed it the next day.
Okay.
Anyone else have any questions? We'll go, and then Jane, and then Chuck. Yeah?
Hi.
Hello.
My question is, what happens if, I understand we have to do all this prep work and figure out where we would put the zoning. What happens if we just say no? We just don't want it?
Several towns, about 10, maybe 15, have taken the bet that nothing happens other than being ineligible for grants that weren't that big in the first place. The Attorney General was of the belief that she can try and force other consequences on you. The State Housing Department is of the belief that it may make you ineligible for more than just those 4 specific grants, but the most likely outcome of the State Supreme Court's case is that they're just simply going to say that we apply the statute exactly as it's written, and so noncompliance means you don't get 4 grants. I'll also tell you that the governor's new housing bill is written with a carrot and stick approach. It does not assume compliance with 3A. 3A. For example, for those who may have heard, some people call it a mansion tax. It really isn't. There's the governor's new housing bond bill will have not only inclusionary zoning, which kind of bakes 40B into your zoning. It also has a transfer tax on potentially on houses over $1 million. If you comply, you could have an additional tax on the transfer of land of any houses worth more than $1 million. And your city or town would not be eligible under the governor's housing bond bill to levy that tax unless you were compliant with 3A. So the governor's bond bill seems to assume that not everyone's going to comply, and it provides a ton more carrots to try and encourage compliance. Does that help a little bit? And you had a question.
Yeah, thanks. So since we have the 40A, 3A, and 40B up on the screen, I know clearly there's a difference in the way that they're implemented. My question comes to the argument about the constitutionality
Yes, sir.
argument on 3A. How is that different than the constitutionality on 40B, which was a state-imposed mandate? Or the state's mandate that we must have an overlay district that allows for medical marijuana dispensaries, or an overlay district that says we must allow adult entertainment. How are those different than the 3A from the constitutional standpoint?
Well, the answer it boils down to threefold, and the answer is that 40B was upheld as constitutional even under the Home Rule Amendment in the Zoning Board of Appeals versus of Hanover case. And the court didn't exactly articulate a real clear test, but it dealt with about 6 or 7 factors. And one of the most important factors in why it found that 40B was constitutional despite the text of the Home Rule Amendment was because there's a first pass. Although the state will preempt you if you're not within the safe harbor, it will only preempt you if you're not in the safe harbor. If you have more than 10%, or if you can otherwise, basically because the court held in Hanover, because you have to engage with your ZBA, because it's a lot by lot thing, and because it does not generally displace your zoning code, it said that it was okay. It also was influenced by the fact that in the 1969 enactment of Chapter 40B, which postdates Home Rule by about 2 years, it actually declared that there was a public housing emergency. And the weight under constitutional cases that we give the legislature when it determines in its own jurisdiction what is and what isn't an emergency, that also played part of a factor in the Hanover decision. If you ask directly as opposed to, say, the marijuana laws or what have you, the answer is that I don't think anyone brought a home rule challenge. Home rule challenge, some people regard home rule as a myth. They don't think it really exists. Even though it's written right there, they don't think it applies, or they think the state can override it. But the answer is that the home rule clearly carved out some very specific areas where the towns can't legislate and said anything else you can. Now, you're not allowed, there are some laws that we want to be universal, like an electrical code or building code or fire code. We want you to be able to hire a contractor from New Hampshire or Rhode Island and come in using more or less the same national rules and be able to go to work in your town without any questions. And so where there's a significant weighty concern like that, where the state is regulating an industry rather than a locality, there's no question that the state can preempt local regulations even if it does so accidentally or not on purpose. This, however, is a law that is expressly aimed at localities. This law says that there must be a district in Wrentham, there must be a district in Rockport, there must be a district in Linfield. And it specifically is trying to displace the town's existing zoning in favor of what the state has mandated. And so that makes it a different kind. But you also run into those, I don't know if any of you have had issues, I think it was the town of Mendon about 4 or 5 years ago that had issues with adult entertainment districts. And believe it or not, the reason you have to have one of those has nothing to do with the state constitution, because it's protected under the First Amendment. You have to have an adult entertainment district. And if you don't, then the developer is, under the federal constitution, entitled to preempt your zoning and basically plop it down wherever they like. The town of Mendon found that out over the course of about 5 years, litigating up and down to the First Circuit twice. But that's because that's a higher law. The federal constitution preempts all. The state constitution will preempt state statutes. In terms of marijuana dispensaries, because the regulation was aimed primarily at an industry rather than a locality, or so I would surmise. Remember that Zoning Board of Hanover Appeals case was dense. There isn't a clear, articulable test that comes out of it. I can speculate to you just as well as the next attorney about what types of laws are aimed at localities versus industries, and what would be preempted, what isn't. And the state Supreme Court has never really given us a clear answer in the 60-some-odd years. The only reason I can stand in front of you today and argue zoning is because zoning has come up, and the state Supreme Court has said that zoning is one of those home rule powers. And so I get to argue that they can't make you do it. In terms of their ability to preempt, in our lawsuit, they have definitely argued that. They have argued that the legislature is the supreme power in zoning, and they have the right to preempt. But basically, their argument is we could draw the maps anyway, so it's okay if we make you do it. And I don't agree with that. I think home rule is a lot stronger than the Attorney General credits it. But even if you take the Attorney General's argument on its own steam, even if they could have drawn the maps, they didn't. And that's the argument about the gallows. There is a difference between being asked to erect your own gallows. Does that make sense?
We're going to wrap it up real quick. We want to be a couple more questions, and then I saw this gentleman here, and then Mr. McGovern, I believe, in the back.
Has any town thought of thinking outside the box?
You speak into that.
Sure. Has any of the towns thought of thinking outside of the box? One thing that came to my mind is, since we're already in compliance with 40B, and we're actually at 10.9%, is if we were to say any larger development has to have a minimum of 20, 30% 40B, so it's economically unfeasible for any developer to come in. So if we put a law in and say, hey, we're going to vote in this, any big development, you have to give us 20, 25, 30% 40B. Any developer says, I'm not going to go there because I'm going to lose money. It's not going to work out. So let's think outside the box.
Towns like Chelmsford have tried, and it isn't clear that it will work, but it's not clear that it's going to fail.
Bellingham's doing it now.
Bellingham, I will add to my list. Chelmsford, for example, was looking at the idea of trying to make it. See, the cool part about making it unfeasible is that you would comply with the law, but you wouldn't comply with the State Department's housing guidelines. So as long as you comply with the law on its face, and then you want to argue that the state housing guidelines are in advance of the statute or have exceeded the statute. Because remember, the guidelines theoretically only allow the state housing department to determine the reasonable size of the district. All of the rest about area, acreage, density, formulas, Chapter 40B, 10% affordability, none of that's mentioned in the statute. There's no indication that they have the power to draw those guidelines. Yes, if you wanted to pick a legal fight, you could draw a district that on its face complies with the text of that 3-paragraph law, and then separately argue that the guidelines are illegal or what we call ultra vires. I know Chelmsford's doing it. I will add Bellingham to my list. Some towns are looking at it, and God bless them. Keep in mind that there are folks in the housing department who work 40 hours a week to try and figure out ways to prevent people from going around it like that. But you're not alone in thinking so.
They want us, in order to have compliance, so we get some of these grants, they're saying we want to have 10% and we need to be in that safe harbor. Well, we're trying to offset any other developments that are not 40B by keeping it in a section that we know we can control.
Chelmsford is one of the towns that's looking at that. I think Shrewsbury may also be, but I'm not sure.
We're going to, Mr. McGovern, you want to wrap us up with the last question?
Thank you. And thank you, Mr. Gallo, for giving an Irishman a microphone in his hand. Could you, you kind of alluded to this a little bit, but could you be a little more in detail about what's the authority or the special circumstances that makes this a zoning law we can vote in with only a simple minority and not the 2/3 that we do for everything else?
So part of the Economic Development Bill added Section 3A to Chapter 40A. That's the MBTA housing law. One of the other sections of the Economic Development Bill in 2021 said that if you have one of 4 specific priorities, and they're listed out, there are 4 subparagraphs in Chapter 40A, Section 5, 5th paragraph. They're numbered. And if you have one of those 4 numbered things, instead of the 2/3, you only need a simple majority. I don't remember them all off the top of my head. I know one is a starter home district. I know one is a Chapter 40R district. I know one is ADUs as of right, either at a portion or across a whole town. And I know that one is the adoption of housing in an eligible location, which when you backdoor it through the definition section of Chapter 40A, brings you back to MBTA zoning under Section 3A. So adopting into MBTA zoning is one of these express paragraphs that lowers the threshold. Believe it or not, one of our home rule arguments, separate from even the concept of MBTA zoning, is that the legislature shouldn't be able to change the threshold like this, because the quantum of when you pass a zoning bylaw should be part of the makeup of your local government, and that definitely is, without question, your local government makeup is part of home rule. So hopefully that answers your question.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having
Appreciate
us.
you coming. Do you have, oh yeah, yes. You've given us a lot of information. We appreciate that. Thank you for coming down and volunteering your time with our group. At this time, I'm going to make a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second, third, all in favor? Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries.
Everybody's favorite motion.